Okay, you ready to get this party started, Hooman?
Let's go.
Okay,
I,
hello
I have my
everybody.
liquid death, so let's do it.
Yeah, and I have my liquid life, so perfect.
Oh,
Um,
I'm not sure why it's called liquid death. It's water. It's the opposite.
hello everybody. Thank you all for attending our conversation with Hooman Radfar. He is a Expa venture partner and CEO and co-founder of Collective. My name is Lisa Besserman, and I'm the managing director here at Expa, and I'm leading their pre-seed accelerator program. And today we'll be talking with Hooman about his journey as an entrepreneur, how he founded AddThis with a 9-figure exit to Oracle, his path to Expa, and then also what inspired him to co-found Collective, any tools and tricks and advice he has for existing entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs. As a reminder, we will be taking questions from the audience towards the end of the session, so please feel free to leave your questions in the Q&A. Before we jump into our conversation, I'd just like to take a moment to introduce Expa. Expa is an early stage venture fund. We back visionary founders on a wide range of sectors. We are investment agnostic. We invest in startups during their earliest of stages through our Expa Accelerator program, which is our pre-seed investment program, and then up through Series A through Expa Ventures. Our Expa partners are builders themselves. We say Expa is by builders for builders, and some of our teammates have led organizations like Uber, Twitter, Virgin Galactic, and Command. So if you're starting a company, we definitely want to hear from you. Feel free to check out our site, expa.com. That's my plug for Expa. And without further ado, we will start the main event. We have Hooman Radfar with us. Hooman is a visionary serial entrepreneur, investor, innovator, disruptor, and probably most important, all-around great guy who I thoroughly enjoy speaking with. He co-founded and led the social bookmarking company AddThis in 2006. AddThis is seen by nearly 2 billion monthly visitors, and Hooman led AddThis to a $175 million acquisition by Oracle. Beyond that, Hooman has been a lifelong investor, investing and supporting over 30 startups, including unicorns like Uber, Sweetgreen, Thrive Market, and Convoy. And now I'm very hungry because I haven't eaten lunch yet. But after AddThis, Hooman became a founding partner at Expa, where he helped lead the fund seed stage strategy. And currently, Hooman is the CEO and co-founder of Collective. Collectively recently raised a $20 million Series A led by General Catalyst. And Collective creates a platform that allows small businesses to run their companies on autopilot, handling all of the tedious back office stuff like taxes, bookkeeping, accounting, etc. Hooman, it is great to be here with you. That was a very long intro because you have quite an impressive background. So thank you for coming to speak about your journey.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm psyched.
Cool. So we want to get to know you more. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. I am an immigrant. My parents left the Iranian Revolution in '79. I was actually born in London. I'm sure you could tell by my really awesome accent.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up moving to Pennsylvania. My parents had family in Pittsburgh, and I grew up there. So all of my schooling was there. That's where I got my start, my introduction to the States. And, it's been an interesting journey since then, but coming into this country as an immigrant and having your parents not speak the language natively and also start their own businesses, they were physicians, but they both had their own offices, was more transformative on my future than I thought. So it's been amazing.
So you and I discussed this yesterday, and then I recently did a tweet about the correlation between immigrants and entrepreneurship. I thought you had some pretty interesting topics. Can you talk a little bit more about the connection between immigration and immigrants and entrepreneurship, and why we're seeing this emergence of entrepreneurs as immigrants?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of great studies, and I've spoken to a lot of venture folks about this. In particular, if you look at, I believe it's over 40% of the Fortune 500 was founded by or is led by immigrants or children of immigrants. And I think one of the big potential hypotheses that I have for why is that, when you come to a new country, you're fundamentally destabilized. So my parents, for example, didn't know the culture, didn't know the language. And so because that lack of infrastructure creates a lack of security. And I think my theory is that, immigrants and children of immigrants almost feel like they have to work their way through that. And, there's a grit, there's a work ethic that comes with that. And I don't think it's, particular to, a culture per se, right? We're Persian. I know there's Asian immigrants, there's people from all different countries, but I do think there's a fundamental psychology that gets formed when you come to a new country that, can be transformed into something pretty awesome.
Yeah, and I definitely think that there is a bigger risk appetite, because when you're willing to give everything up to move to a new place, a lot of that connects with entrepreneurship, whether you're giving up a lot of comforts and you're starting something new without the expectation of, or without the knowledge of it succeeding. So it's an interesting connection. You studied computer science and economics at Carnegie Mellon, is that correct?
So at undergrad, when I was at University of Pennsylvania, I studied computer science and economics.
Okay.
For graduate school, I was studying networking. So I was in an interdisciplinary program inside the engineering school, and I actually originally went there because I was interested in high-speed video, because I was enamored with this concept of video on demand, because I hated Blockbuster so much. I actually thought Netflix at the time, this is going to date myself, Netflix used to send DVDs. And I thought to myself, wow, this is so dumb. We had high-speed internet in school. I thought this was going to permeate everywhere. Everyone's going to watch it on, their computer or some connected device. There was this idea of smart TVs. And so I wanted to create that service. And when I was in grad school, that's what I was studying. The timing, obviously, it happened just a few years later. But what ended up happening when I was there is I picked up a paper on how network theory, so graphs, could be applied to social structures and modeling social structures, which is how I fell into the rabbit hole of social networking.
Very cool. And after graduating, did you jump straight into entrepreneurship with AddThis, or were there some smaller projects that got you there along the way? And then, of course, what was the catalyst towards entrepreneurship for you?
So I'll start with the first question. So the catalyst, actually, interesting enough, was an Expa LP. So there's a guy named Josh Koppelman who founded First Round Capital, and he was giving a talk at Penn, and I believe I was 19 or 20 years old. And you have to understand, like, going back to being an immigrant, my parents, God bless them, they're like, work hard, do well in school, get to the best school. But ultimately, their ability to give me options in terms of coaching me, like, oh, you could be an investment banker or a consultant, were limited, right, by their knowledge. And so they were encouraging me to go into professions, and that's what they had the most knowledge: be a doctor, be a lawyer, like do something that requires high education, is defensible, and ultimately has low risk. And that didn't seem right for me, but I didn't know any alternatives. And I went to this talk, and it was during the .com, and Josh was giving it, and he had just sold a company called half.com to eBay, and he had actually taken a company public prior, Infinitics. And he gets up on stage, and I look at this guy, and my friend sitting to my left, who actually started 3 companies since, we both are like, this guy looks like a kid. Like, we're allowed to do this? This is amazing. And the next guy to speak was the founder of Benchmark, Andy Ratcliffe, and Andy had just started Benchmark. So I chatted with both of them, and I looked at it, and I knew that was the moment I was hooked. I remember it very distinctly. And I think I've actually told Josh that, but I credit that as being the catalyst for the why. Now the .com happens, and then everything goes away. And I felt so cheated. So I go to grad school to lick my wounds. And during grad school, my office mate at the time, Austin Fath, he was really interested in we were both had this vision for the web that was beyond where it was. So his area of study was, how do you transform the web from a publishing platform into a platform for services? So, I mean, now we're all used to APIs. We're used to everyone having that. There was no REST, there was no AJAX, there was no browser-based development then. So the concept was, how do you do that? So you had to that was a research area at Carnegie Mellon. So do you use XMLRPC, WSDL, SOAP? Like, what are the standards? How will we build this web as a platform? My research area ended up being around social graphs and multi-agent systems. So when we graduated, we had these ideas in our head of how the web could change. And to be candid, at the time, it was really tough because we were coming out of Pittsburgh. It wasn't like a robust ecosystem to start with, and then it was after the .com, so there's no VC. So we basically got grants, we consulted, we had a concept that we were whittling around, but ultimately, I mean, we were doing it old school, like hacking around, trying different things, until in 2005-ish, there was a confluence of our feedback from the investor community, networking, and just testing out that ended up becoming the seed for what was AddThis. And the idea was simple: the web was going to become social, right? There was going to be this networks. There's 300 networks competing at the time, believe it or not. And we thought that publishers, advertisers were going to want to figure out how to tap into that because there's a huge audience there. And so could we provide tools to websites to help them tap into it? So originally we were thinking of it more of as a developer platform, but ultimately AddThis was a marketing platform, marketing automation platform, which is why Oracle bought us. But I definitely didn't think that was the case. Like if you would have told me out of grad school I was going to start a marketing automation company, I would have been like, you're high.
So speaking of the Oracle acquisition, how long were you operating for AddThis before you began your conversations with Oracle? And can you tell us a little bit about the acquisition and what that was like?
Yeah, so AddThis was a long run because we started in 2006 formally with our first round. It was about 10 years end to end, I think, with the acquisition. But for me, I took a number of different roles. So I ran it all the way through the end of the recession. So like call it 2011, 2012. And then I transitioned into a chairman role. We hired a CEO, learned a lot through that experience, didn't work out, came back, got more active, promoted our then COO to CEO. And then he ultimately landed the plane and I was chairman of the company. So I had moved out west when we sold it. And the way Oracle happened was pretty organic. And I often tell people this, like, you don't want to sell your company. You want your company to be bought. And what ended up happening is, so we were the largest behavioral data broker on the web. So just to give some background to the folks in the audience, if you're not familiar, AddThis was free tools. That's primarily what we're known with. So sharing, following, you add them to your website, your traffic goes up via analytics. Then we had a premium version. But what was like, I think the gold for Oracle was through those 15 million sites, we had 1 trillion page views, we had 2 billion unique users. We saw every user, 140 plus times per month. And so we could build these really unique audiences, and those could be applied to either personalized websites. Yahoo ended up using our data to personalize yahoo.com. Microsoft used it for advertising. And so we, when the programmatic infrastructure came up, if you're familiar, right? So like all the ad exchanges, we were just this massive data set. Like Yahoo wasn't going to sell their audience information. Facebook most certainly wasn't going to do it. So who was going to do it at scale? And so we partnered with a company called BlueKai, which was like, think of it like iTunes. If the data is the music, then BlueKai is iTunes and distributes it. And BlueKai ended up getting bought by Oracle. And Omar, who was the CEO, had this vision of rolling up the data stack. So they went and ran and rolled up us, Datalogix, Moat, you name it. So they built their alternative to the Google Facebook stack. So it was interesting. I learned a lot, but they partnered with us actually quite a bit. So we partnered with BlueKai, we partnered with Oracle International. So I think we had 3 partnerships before they bought us. And I think they just did the math and it made no sense for us to be separate entities at the time.
Interesting. Well, a lot of people say that the path to success, and we're talking about, major success, having your company acquired by Oracle, is paved in failures. So I'm sure a lot of people here are wrestling with their own failures on a day-to-day basis. Are there any failures you can share with us about your journey to entrepreneurship that kind of stick with you, or things that you've particularly learned from those failures?
It's funny. We talked about this before, and I was trying to think of what's the worst. There's just so many.
So no, and that we should talk about how many. I mean, this should be more of a conversation, because a lot of times people see entrepreneurs like yourself with these, incredible successes, and they don't realize that there are so many failures along the way, and so many times where I'm sure you wanted to quit or you thought it was over, but you just kept on going.
Yeah, I think there's, I think of them as setbacks more than failures. To me, failure is a pretty extreme word, and only because it's when you're done. So I'll give you an example. So when we came out of grad school, I'd never worked before, let alone start a company, let alone start a tech company that I had aspirations to do VC. So it was, and again, it wasn't like now. You have, the Expa program, you have YC's program, you have Techstars, you have VC out, the wazoo, you have open source term sheets. Like we have the safe. People say safe, like it's like nothing. YC did that. They open sourced that. It's just like this floating in ether thing. No, someone sat down and wrote that, and it just wasn't like that. There's like 1 million handbooks, guides. So it was pretty dark, and so we were messing up a lot. We're just trying to find our way through talking to people. And the first year or so, we had a concept, and actually, it's funny. It ended up. It was a good concept actually. So the idea was, you could use web services architectures to pull together disparate data inside an enterprise, and then in the browser, Ajax had just come out, asynchronous JavaScript, so you could build rich applications. And so the idea was we could go into an enterprise like a bank or the government and create these really rich data visualization applications to show them patterns across the data. It was pretty much Palantir. And in fact, Palantir, we didn't know, was starting at the same time on the West Coast. Difference being out of Stanford, backed by Peter Thiel, they had a couple of years to build before they got there. We were not in that position. We had no money. And so, it was just going slow and it was hard. So one lesson learned there was right concept, wrong environment, right? So you can have a great idea, but it's not just timing. You have to have the right context. But one of the third guy that was working with us quit. So we were like banging our head against the wall and he quit. And I'll just like never forget, because I was already exhausted. I wasn't sure if we were like the good enough to do it, because it just like wasn't this immediate, come out the gates, people give us money, right? Kind of thing, either customers or whatever. We just kept trying to learn and hack. And again, I was an engineer by background. I didn't know how to call companies. I was literally like cold calling companies. I mean, it was really hard. And so I called my mom and I was like, yeah, I think I'm not going to do this. I don't know if this is going to work. And I just remember walking behind my apartment back and forth. And she's like, nope. She's like, nope, you got to keep going. Just keep going. It's okay. He doesn't want to be a part of it. It's fine. It's going to be fine. And it was interesting because we stuck to it. And I was like, all right, well, I'll try it for another month. I mean, we were running out of money personally. I was putting my own money into it. And I didn't have any money. So we met a third guy who was on he was like a visual designer, had a great attitude. And, in short, he just brought a lot of light. And what was interesting is we saw, it wasn't that the guy who left was bad, by the way. He went to Amazon, we're all cool. Like, it wasn't that. It's just, it's so important team building to have the right chemistry so you can create positive, constructive movement forward. And it just wasn't happening. And all of a sudden, just like the guy was laughing and we were laughing and we were trying new things and we got more aggressive. And yeah, like we ended up raising money a couple months later, moving the company out to DC. And we, that was it. And we raised our first, big round, and it was a couple $1 million, which, $2 million at the time was a lot. So that was what got us going. But I mean, literally, I was like this close. I had my mom and dad like not giving me that little bit of encouragement. I don't know if I would have been able to keep going.
So the moral of the story is call your parents, everybody. Always call your parents.
I'll tell I said setback. I'll tell you, for entrepreneurs, and I was actually just in that Expa LA office telling one of our companies, Hello, this. We were talking, and Phil, one of the founders of Hello, was telling me he remembers one thing, and him and Vern talk about this. There's really two surefire ways that you will actually fail as a company, and I define failure as shutting down the company or the company doesn't work out, run out of money, or quit. If you don't do those two things, everything else is a setback up to that moment. If be a big setback, it can suck. That was a setback. And so I think resiliency and grit are a massive, massive, massive part of this game. And you can take all the classes you want. You can do anything you want. Can't teach that. That's just got to come from you, and you have to want it. It's a muscle.
Well, actually, that's a perfect segue, because yesterday, I don't know if you saw Garrett. So Garrett Camp, co-founder of Uber, founder of StumbleUpon, and our fearless leader at Expa. He tweeted yesterday, like, what is the most important characteristic of a great founder? And so would you say that you think the most important characteristic is grit and resiliency?
If I had to pick one, I think grit. If I had the option to pick two, I'd say the ability to learn quickly. Because ultimately, if you have that strength and that willingness to move forward, and you're learning very quickly, you're like pretty unstoppable. I think the best entrepreneurs I've seen are learning machines. Like, you look at Convoy as an example. There was, when we met them, it was two guys. They had a general plan of how they were going to disrupt trucking with an Uber-like marketplace idea. This company is now like, $3 billion, $4 billion company. It's been 6 years. Thousands of people work there. Offices across the country, moving billions of dollars of freight. And so why? Because Dan and Grant are really, really phenomenal at learning, moving quickly. Like, Dan is not the guy that I met, and that's to his credit. So, and I think that's a combination of just grit and learning, because you can learn, but if you don't have the resiliency, like, you're going to make mistakes. I'm wrong like tons of the time. It's just, That's you cannot learn without being wrong. That's the notion. So if you can't take the setback there, then I don't know what you're going to do.
Well, it's funny you bring that up because I heard a story, and this is talking about learning and kind of just carving your own path to learn for what you're building. I heard a story, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but the founders of Convoy, they were actually going to truck stops and setting up barbecues so they could talk to their users because they needed to get the user interviews and understand what their users needed. And the best way to do that was to go to them rather than expect them to come to them. So I thought that was interesting. A new approach to entrepreneurship. It's like really getting on the ground and learning your customers and going to where they are, which I think is a really valuable lesson.
Oh yeah, I mean, look, I'll say the other thing. Every part of building a company involves selling. And I know especially like my friends who are like me, come from an engineering background, that can feel, I don't know, disingenuous and authentic because selling somehow might imply that, you're kind of like roping someone in. I think you're selling someone who to join your company. You're selling someone to buy your product. You're selling an investor to pick the big vision. You're selling your management team to stay. You're constantly trying to create an environment of constructive and positive optimism that is future leaning enough and hopeful enough that they want to stay without being disingenuous, right? Because if you overpromise and underdeliver, they'll leave.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really, really hard to do that. And so I think it's important to be able to cultivate that skill set. And of course, the most important person or group, I should say, is the customer, right? Because businesses are really simple. I tell my team at Collective this all the time. Our first value is people first. So the first thing is we got to take care of each other, right? And we're a group of people that's taking care of each other so that as a group, we can take care of the largest group of founders in the country. Business of one. That's it. We're like relentlessly focused on them. Business is people helping people. The technology is an enabler. And I love technology. Believe me, I'm like the deepest. I love it. I'm a geek. But if you forget those facts, the core of your business is broken.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, I guess this can bring us on to the next point of learning a little bit more about Collective. So, at Expa, we have a saying, Expa was created by builders for builders. So it might not be surprising that you went off to co-found another company, Collective. So can you tell us what made the mission of Collective so appealing to you that you knew you had to start this business, and how did the idea come about?
For Collective, so Collective is interesting. I feel like Collective is the natural evolution of where I've been in my career, if you'll call it that. I don't know what my career is, but in my trajectory professionally. So I came out of school, I was a builder, I was an engineer, and I got to move from an engineer to a founder and a founder to a CEO. But that was a great experience for me to learn how to transform those engineering type lessons into, kind of one level of abstraction up, right? Because building a company is in some part like engineering. You're just operating at a different level of abstraction. Then, working with Garrett when, Expa was starting out and Roberto and the team at the time, it was phenomenal because I think we shared this same vision of how can we be the partner that we wish we had when we were building just recently and become founders helping founders, right? We created, programs where we could have space, we could sit next to them, we could jam with them. It was just, it was really fun. And I enjoyed that. But I think one of the things I saw was venture-backed founders have all this amazing support and help, programs led by people like you who are showing them how to do things or showing them what not to do. What about the rest of America? What about the rest of the world? What do they do? Like, I'm thinking back to my parents. Nobody helped my mom, and there was no Google at the time, right? Mm-hmm. And so what if we could democratize some of that knowledge? We have the internet. People are comfortable with tools in the cloud. People are comfortable with people being virtual, right? What can we do to put a business in a box for them? And so I started to think about this concept, and I talked to Roberto, one of our partners there, a lot about this. And interestingly enough, while I was starting to work on this, I met my co-founder, and is from Turkey, and he's a more recent immigrant. And he had been a freelancer and lost money in taxes. And he comes in, he literally pitches me a similar concept, except focusing on freelancers and businesses of one. And so we had we spent a lot of time. I say it's the longest seed round of all time because we spent like weeks together talking about values, taking walks, and decided to start the company together with our third co-founder, who was his best friend from college, Boo. And Boo literally slept on his floor. He moved from Turkey and slept on his floor. That's how much he believed in this.
Mhm.
And that was kind of the origin story for how we came together. And now, Collective for me personally lets me be a founder again. I'm a founder helping founders like at Expa, but I'm doing it for the largest group of founders. And our vision is very simple. What we want to do is make these businesses more financially successful by letting them focus on their passion and not their paperwork, right?
Mhm.
We want to do the things that are necessary, but they're not sufficient. Nobody wins a prize and makes, their business work by doing their accounting, corporation, taxes, credit card, insurance. They're important. They are. They can really hurt you. But if you're going to be, in my parents' case, a physician, be the best physician. If you're a designer, be the best designer. Why do you need to handle these things? And so that's our worldview is you guys do that. We're here in the background and we're here for you. We're the team that you don't want to hire and manage, right? Because you want it to be a business of one, but you need.
Mhm. And how have things been for Collective during the pandemic? Did that affect you guys at all?
It was an interesting period, I think, for everybody.
Sure.
I laugh because like, what else are you going to do? Because all of us went through this together. It's like one of the largest shared experiences, I think, that we can all relate to as a society. But at first, to be honest, it was really hard because we just got seed funding. We were, I don't know, all together hiring, I think, for 2 months before we had to like split up. A company was not built for remote. The majority of our team that had joined at the time had been there maybe 2 weeks, didn't know each other well. We were not set up for best practice for virtual remote at all. Our product we're in the middle of tax season and the deadlines were changing. So I'd say at the beginning, it was a challenge to say the least. And I operated a company through the worst recession, one of the worst recessions ever. That was not as hard in some ways. And, we had the social unrest and whatnot, but from a macro trend perspective, so that was a headwind. On the tailwind side, there's been an explosion, because what ended up happening is all of the companies started saying, okay, two things. One, I'm not sure about the economic climate. I'm not sure what's going to happen. So what you do is you shift from W-2 full-time employees to contractors. So there was this explosion in demand for freelancers, contractors, and whatnot. Second thing that happened, which was a major catalyst, is because we all had to be at home, everyone went remote. And you can't underestimate how impactful that's been, because if you're a company, like a medium-sized company, and you're in California, it's easier for you to have contractors in other states than it is to hire them as an employee, because then you have to have like an HR benefits person and make sure you're all compliant. But if it's just an invoice, it's super easy. So, I mean, we saw our core membership, we saw some of their income go crazy. I mean, I'm telling you, people were going from like 300 grand to $1 million. It was insane. We have had, thousands and thousands of people apply for a membership at Collective, thousands. It was phenomenal. So, yeah, I think the space is ripe, and it's one of those things. Like, we had the vision, we started working on it. Can't plan for those type of events. Don't wish that event, but it did have this benefit to us in that respect.
So I just want to remind everybody that we will be doing a Q&A session in the next few minutes. So please feel free to get your questions in. And so let's switch over. So we've covered, your incredible path to entrepreneurship, but you are also quite a successful investor as well. If there's a through line to your story, it's that you're an innovator and an early adopter. So you started investing out of your personal fund called 10E9 in companies like Uber, Sweetgreen, and Thrive Market, which are all unicorns today. So curious, what stood out to you about these companies when you first heard about them?
So I think in hindsight, when you look at things backwards, I could take the credit and say I had a clearer point of view than I do now. I think I've formed the ability to kind of start to form thesis-based bets. And this is something actually I tell people all the time. If there's a book, Thinking in Bets, I highly advise everyone reads it. That was what I learned from venture, right? Which you can apply to operating. Every decision you have is actually a bet if you want to be really discerning, right? We have a context, we have a short period of time, right? And we have to make a decision. But that's the same thing in operating, actually. So like, am I going to hire this person or not? Oh, I have an opportunistic hire. There's a VP of product available right now. You have 3 weeks. We're not hiring a VP product. You want to go make a run or not, right? All of these things are structured bets that you have to make. And so you have to learn how to make quality decisions in this period of time. Venture is a really interesting training ground for that because, at first I started out, I'm like, oh, I have to have a process of a thesis. Again, I'm an engineering mentality, but then I realized, you have to adapt quickly. So what do you do if someone says you have a week? My process is 2 weeks. What if someone says, I'm in a space you've never heard of? What if, you know what I mean? There's all these like aberrations. So you start to learn how to adapt. But I would say the common thread among all of them was fairly simple. I'll go back to my first principle. I always go for people. So it was the first value in my first company, people first value in the second company with Collective that my co-founders and I agreed on independently, by the way. They picked that. We all picked that independently. I didn't dictate that. And I look at that. So when I look at sweetgreen, for example, they're going to IPO. They actually just bought another one of my companies, Spice, which was a really fun first time event for me that I had two companies I really loved coming together. And the founders, they were so mission driven. They loved what they were doing and they were just so exceptional. I'll never forget. So I was in their office. They were originally in DC. They started the first sweetgreen in Georgetown. And I met them because the CEO is a Persian guy. And like literally one of my friends like, you're Persian, he's Persian, you should meet. And I'm like, I don't know anything about salad, like I don't know anything about this stuff, but I was interested in trying to expand my aperture to understand local businesses and, so maybe I could understand the technology go into it. And I met these guys and they were in their office at like 8, 9 o'clock on a Friday working. And it was like I wasn't there, and it was really amazing. They were playing this thing called the Sweet Life Festival. They had like Calvin Harris, Kendrick Lamar. I'm like, how is this possible? And they gave me tickets and I went. And I'm like, how did these three guys pull off this festival as a salad company? And I started going to all their locations because there weren't that many. And literally lines out the door. I mean, and what I realized is this was a lifestyle brand. These guys are not trying to build a salad company. They're trying to build a healthy lifestyle brand where they have multiple products and they're just phenomenal at doing it. So I saw a huge market opportunity. I saw the trend that things were going to change and the people, but it always starts with the people. And if you have people like that are really fundamentally pretty unbelievable and like I call it the freight train, right? So like they're going. If you're an investor, you're lucky to get on, but they don't need you really, honestly. Like that's what I look for first and foremost. And then if that freight train is heading towards something I believe in that's very big and transformative, it's usually something that I want to get on. Thrive Market was similar, right? You saw the shift to online groceries and they, figured out an amazing Costco style model to get you healthy organic products. And so the macro trend was people were moving to health and they were moving online and these guys figured out a really interesting wedge. And they just had a really, really phenomenal go-to-market. The team was just insane. Like they went to 100 million in revenues so fast. So I have like this pattern, and I typically look in businesses that are like, I would say they've been like a little more like off the beaten path, boring. I think they're getting more interesting now. Like Onfido was digital identity verification. They're going to go public next year. It's a huge company now. No one wanted to invest in it. Literally, I took it to a bunch of people. No one wanted to invest in it. But I think it'll be a couple billion. So I think it's just you gotta start with the people.
It's the people first. Yeah, that is good advice for investors and aspiring investors as well, and entrepreneurs when they're building their team as well. So we have a couple questions from the audience. I want to get to those. This first one is from Sean Adler. I believe it was either you or Garrett that managed their company as their own board of directors. What feedback do you have when it comes to board composition and whether a board is necessary pre-Series A?
Trying to think of the best way to answer this. So necessary, I don't think like the board is necessary per se before a Series A. I think it can be beneficial. Like especially if you're a first-time entrepreneur, I wouldn't recommend starting a board to have a board because it's the governing body and they're actually supposed to have a fiduciary obligation and they should be able to hire and fire the CEO. So I typically advise, don't have a board before you need a board, but you should have advisors early, right? And in particular for founders, even me, like I always try to have a set of neutral parties that are not on the board, don't work at the company or for me, that I can go to be unfiltered, make mistakes, pre-process information. So you can get a lot of what you would get out of a board for that. So I've been on several boards and I was the chairman of my board You have to be very, and then the advice for managing it, pick your partners carefully.
Excellent. Great words of advice. Speaking of words of advice, the next one is, what are your words of advice to early stage founders working on their business today? When starting out, how do you know what to prioritize? What do you think of venture capital and the startup climate these days? I might have to repeat those questions. There's a few. So first
Okay.
one, what are your words of advice for early stage founders working on their businesses today?
My first advice is learn to learn quickly. Like, the ability to fail fast is actually a huge superpower. So that's what I would recommend focusing on. And don't, when I told one of the Expa founders who's a close friend, the founder of Input, Jeff Wong, product market fit is like a resonance, so sometimes you hit it and it's just challenging. Entrepreneurs might think, oh, if I do this one more thing, it's one more thing. When it happens, it's really happening. So don't overimpose what you want to have happen on what's actually happening. Like, deal with the facts and learn quickly and move with those facts. It's a really, really great power to have. And if you surround yourself with people who have that attitude, right? It doesn't mean you're stark. It doesn't mean you don't have vision, but if you see the facts and you actually see them for what they are and you operate on them, you can actually move much more quickly than you're like trying to distort reality around what you want to have happening. Let that data guide you. That's my advice.
Mm. And then the second part of the question is, when starting out, how do you know what to prioritize?
So I use so there's two types of companies, right? There's to be very vanilla. Either you're going to fund growth via retained earnings and profitability, or you're going to say that you're building something that requires more upfront capital and you're going to operate a operating deficit, and usually a venture capital or some other funding source. If you're in the venture business, which probably a lot of you want to be or are interested in, which is why you're on this call, you're running out of cash constantly, right? That's the definition, because you chose that path. So then the way I prioritize is quite simple. So like, let's say you're in a seed round, right? So like, what I would say is you have to basically work backwards. So say you're raising your seed, or sorry, you're in a seed and you're going to Series A. Maybe that's an easier example. You work forward and you say, okay, what has to be true to get to the Series A, right? What 3 to 4 things have to be true? So for example, if you do a seed, typically it's some version of product market fit. Maybe that's measured by retention or churn. It depends on your business, right? I have to show it at more scale than like one person. So you have to figure out what that level of scale is so that it really looks convincing. And maybe there's some semblance of go to market, again, depending on whether you're consumer or enterprise. Then the next question you say is, well, how do I pick those? Easy. Go talk to venture capitalists. They love talking. Talk to like 5 or 6 Series A people. Don't say you're raising. Just say, hey, I'm calibrating on my raise. Here's kind of what I'm going for. You'll start seeing a pattern. And then you also do secondary research and talk to folks, and you'll say, okay, cool. I probably need to get to like 1 million in run rate. I need to show this kind of retention. I need to show it's different. Like in my business, for example, margin is more important because we're tech-enabled service. If you're in a SaaS business, no one's going to care what your margin is, right? They care more about what your go-to-market and your churn is. And so you have to pick the right endpoint for the shape, and then you work backwards, and it'll violently prioritize, right? Because if you only have 3 to 5 things to operate on, turns out, say you have 12 months to operate, you actually only have 6 months to build, 6 to 8 months. So you just won't have a lot of choice if you want to hit those 3 to 5 metrics, and it'll become very clear to you.
Okay, on to the next question from Rebecca. With everything being virtual, it seems so hard building more meaningful relationships with potential investors. What can a founder do to build trust and meaning in this environment?
Oof, that's hard. It's a great question.
We didn't say the questions are going to be easy.
No. I like them. And if you guys have harder questions, go for it. I don't mind.
We have quite a few more questions. So are you cool to go up for a few minutes?
Yeah, I can go for a few minutes. So here's what I would say. Start building relationships earlier than you would. So a lot of times you will wait. Don't treat investing and the round as a process and a deal to be done. Treat it as relationships to be built. So that's really true. You want to go, like, I always try to raise before I raise. Like, I got preempted twice. Why? Because I have the relationships earlier. And a lot of my companies that I advise, you do legwork prior. Like, you get to know people, see who's like interested, who's not. And that's why these rounds can happen quickly. You read about them in TechCrunch, you're like, what? But you don't give credit to the founder. They've been working on this for a while, right? And so in a virtual environment, what I would say is you even have to start earlier. So the best time to talk to VCs is when you need nothing, like, and you just seek advice. So start to talk to people, you see who you have a natural gravity with, and just build like a regular cadence with them. Some of them you might have to say, hey, can I set up a call with you once a month, check in? Some of them, might be more organic. I would also advise for those of you that are comfortable, again, it's COVID, walks are great. If you can walk with people, it's so amazing. You're out there, you get the air. It's actually, I think, better than a meeting or lunch. And just try to build those relationships. Just go earlier and get their advice. And it's a two-way street. They'll have a gravity towards you or not. You're going to feel it. And then you have your list. So you're going to have to start earlier in the virtual side. That's my opinion. If you want to build a good partnership, doesn't mean you won't raise if you don't do that, by the way. You may raise, but you may not like who you end up with.
And I'd love to add, investors don't only invest in products, they're investing in people. So the more they get to know you, and like as Hooman mentioned, building those relationships are quite important to finding that next round. Another thing is also go to where they are, and I'm not saying physically. Investors speak at lots of events, things like this. Reach out to them, follow, read what they're writing, read what they're publishing on Medium, follow their newsletters, and reach out and do so in a way to build a relationship without it necessarily being transactional from the beginning. Next question is, how is the change from hands-on entrepreneur to invest?
How was the change? It was brutal. It was brutal to go back. You remember yourself as better than you were. I like to think I have some humility, and hopefully I didn't come off as anything other than a student. Again, I often tell my team, like, we have a principle. Another one of our values is Kaizen, continuous learning. It comes from the lean manufacturing. So I think that gives you a lot of room to make mistakes, which is healthy. But I think the first couple of months were hard, just getting back into that pace and understanding it. So when in investing, again, you can think in bets, there's a lot of skills you build, but in operating, it's so quick twitch, like everything, and it has ripple effects as the team gets bigger and bigger. Your indecision actually percolates to the entire team. And, when you're in a transactional business like venture, that it's deal oriented, you may miss something, but there's like another transaction, so I think the hardest part was just learning to make decisions more quickly, delegate more quickly, and empower the team. Because you don't have to do it. It's lighter when you're in venture.
We have just the last few questions. This is more tactical. When there are multiple founders, this is from Samir. When there are multiple founders, what are the best ways to decide the ownership share percentage? Is goal and milestone-based equity allocation the best way?
I don't love goal and milestone based because candidly, like it's hard to enforce and people can get upset. So like, as an example, you might say, we're going to do revenue as a goal. And like, you get this equity, you get this revenue. I'm just making it up, Samir. But if it is such a small company, you might say, for example, your equity is contingent on the revenue, but then you believe the product person didn't do their job. That's going to create a conflict. I think it's better to start with what you think is fair. The vesting, there's reason why you're vesting, right? So as you vest, you'll start seeing if the structure makes sense or not. And then you have other opportunities. You can either regreen people as one tool, part ways, but I think the best thing you can do is try to set up the structure as best you can at the beginning. Candidly, I think it should not be even. I don't like even splits. I think it should be commensurate with the value that someone is bringing and their role. And I know this is self-serving, but CEOs, for example, I think should have more because they're going to take more risk and they can get fired the most easily. They bear the fiduciary risk for the company. But again, I mean, it depends. Like maybe you have like some baller CTO who has like tons of experience and doesn't need to work. So you just have to wait that out. But I would take the hard look at what the right structure at the beginning is and do that work at the beginning. Otherwise, it just creates so much conflict along the way.
Helpful. This is from Janelle. Any guidance on selecting an advisory board? Can a founder define what exactly the advisor brings to the table?
Yeah, so I love advisory boards. I wouldn't think of it too formally. I think of it more like an opportunity and program. So like being objective, everyone has a gap. So I have gaps, right? So what you do is I would start and say, look, most advisors vest over 2 years. That's the new thing. It used to be 4. So in the next 2 years, again, working backwards, what's critical that we have to do? Say like the fundraise is coming up in a year. Okay, given the critical things we have to hit, the 3 to 5 things we have to hit, and given our plan, where's the most risk? Like, let's say, for example, you're not a great operator. You've never operated. Okay, that's a risk. Let's say you have an engineering co-founder who's never scaled, but he's technically brilliant. Okay, that's a risk. Identify the risks and then find advisors that can kind of go into those risk buckets and help you along the way. I would treat the advisory program more like a program, less like a board. I mean, you can have them meet and just fill in those. It's almost like hired gun consultants, and they vest over 2 years if they're useful, and fill in your gaps because everything points to that North Star, like what has to be true to raise. And then, they're over in 2 years. Some of them will work really, really well and over deliver. Some of them won't work as well, and then you're done in 2 years.
Thank you. And then our last question is, some people use a framework which they apply on a situation to make a decision. Do you use any generalized frameworks while making a decision? If yes, please share.
I think when I'm making a decision, I always start with my constraints. So when I look at a problem, I look at my constraints because again, in this thinking in bets type framework, you don't have infinite time. And so you can bound your decision-making process by time. So for example, let's say something is a decision I have 6 months to make. I'm going to have a very different diligence process and based on that. So I look at how much time I have. I look at the weight of the decision and the impact, right? So let's say if it's irreversible, I'm going to treat it very differently than if it's a small decision. And then I'll shape, my diligence process based on that. So like as an example, let's say it's a low impact reversible decision, but it needs to be done quickly. If I have someone on my team that is accountable for that, I let them go. They'll do it. I'll look at it and see if I see any issues, but 9 times out of 10, I'll assign it to them because they can learn, right? Low impact on the business, we can reverse it. And I just don't have that much time. If it's really, really big deal, like we're switching something that's $1 million infrastructure software that's going to change the trajectory of the business, then I would like change the diligence process. So I think one way you can make things easier so you can decide is just make sure you know your boundaries, because sometimes I think people want to run through this long process and you just don't have time. And so that it's freeing actually to make sure you really understand your constraints.
Okay, so I said we had one last question, that was it, but one more just came in and I think it's really important and it'll resonate with a lot of people. This one's from Roman, and this is the last question, then we'll close up. But being a CEO can be a lonely place with a lot of eyes on you. What are some ways to learn, make mistakes quickly, and build community?
I think it is I think this is actually one of the best ways to end in a good question. So if you want to be the CEO, I often tell people, so the founder of FedEx Ground, who passed away, was a mentor of mine. They started in Pittsburgh. It was called Rowway Packaging Systems. And I'll never forget this. He took me to lunch and he said, this job is the loneliest job. Your board is always going to want you to go faster and you can't give them the complete story. Not because you can't trust them, but there's reasons. People don't really want to hear the whole thing. They can't. And your management team, you can't tell them everything, right? You can't tell them about certain people that need to leave or issues you have with them. And so that creates this isolation and it actually compounds. So I would go back to first principles here and say, okay, you need to learn, and you also need to be psychologically healthy. So I would advise if they're not advisors, you need to have almost like at a minimum, a handful of people that you can be on speed dial to call, whether they're function specific or whether it's just like to vent. You need to have that. If you don't have someone outside of those two groups, it can become incredibly isolating. So I think it's just more about networking and just do it over time. There's no process. Just make sure you're constantly talking to people, see who you have a natural affinity with, right? I liken relationships to like a grain in wood, right? I talk to my co-founder about this all the time. If you sand wood along the grain, it can be beautiful and smooth. If you sand against the grain, it's rough. Just use your gut and you'll find people that it's as important that you have an outlet that's healthy as it is to get advice sometimes, but the sooner you can begin that process, the better, because that isolation can cause severe issues, depression, anxiety. You're not going to do a great job. So sometimes just talking to other CEOs is great. So I did that all the time with my first company. There are formal ways to do it. You can do like YPO. There are groups now and whatnot if you're there. But honestly, if you network in your industry, you'll start liking people. Just say, hey, can we catch up every month? That's it. and that's it. And you'll start seeing, I have friends I call when I get in trouble, and even people I've invested in. Like I'll call the Convoy guys invested in my company. So I was their investor, and I'm talking to them for advice. You can get advice from anyone.
Yeah, I'd also like to add that, it's navigating those highs and lows, and understanding that the lows don't define you and the setbacks don't define you, and also making space for the wins. Success, especially as an entrepreneur, is a moving goalpost, but it's really about allowing yourself to celebrate those wins and giving yourself credit for the work that you're doing as success moves, but also not allowing those setbacks, not failures, and failures to not define you as a person, as an entrepreneur. And because so much of your identity is tied up in what you're building, that you need to create that space for sure.
I would
just
agree.
have a really
one
strong
thing
network
to,
of people.
Yeah. Just to add to that point, because you just had a really good thought. I would just encourage people, like Lisa just said something very, very, very critical. Entrepreneurship and business is what happens when you press releases. So you have, I don't know, 3 or 4 events a year if you're lucky. You release the product, you have a fundraise, hired someone, then there's all this stuff in between. Your team and you need to have that. It needs to be a marathon, not a sprint. And the only way you can do that is by rewarding these behaviors. Hey, we hit a number. We did this. We had a milestone. So if you can create a culture of gratitude and thankfulness about those things. I'm not saying you have to have like this like hipster happy camp, but like you really, if you don't do that, you can't make a lasting company. And it's super critical, in particular for engineering driven founders who are like, hey, we got to focus on the problem. We got to go on the next thing. It can be like very draining, not just for your team, but for you, and you won't even realize it. So I love that advice, Lisa.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end. We went a few minutes over, so thank you for everybody who stuck around. Thank you so much for Hooman, for your advice for this first founder series. I couldn't think of a better founder to start this off with. So thank you for your time and your guidance. We really appreciate it.
Thanks,
Take
Lisa.
care, everybody.
Talk to you guys. Bye.
See ya.